I never thought the worst day of my life would start with a forgotten suppressant pill. It sat there on my bathroom counter when I came back from brushing my teeth, small, white, innocuous, mocking me with its stillness. I stared at it. I was already running late. My bag was already slung over my shoulder. My shoes were already on. Taking it now would mean waiting another 20 minutes for it to absorb properly, and I couldn't afford to miss the first bus again because Mr. Keene had already given me 2 warnings about tardiness, and a third one meant detention, which meant I'd miss my shift at the bookstore, which meant I'd lose the only income that kept my second-hand manga collection from dwindling. I made the worst decision of my life. I left the pill on the counter. I told myself it would be fine. I was a late-presenting omega, which meant my scent was subtle on a good day, barely there, like the ghost of something sweet that you weren't sure you'd actually smelled at all. Most people couldn't even pick it up unless they were within arm's reach and actively trying. My suppressants were more of a precaution than a necessity, or so I'd always believed. My name is Herb Austin. I'm 18 years old, a senior at Creston High, and up until that morning, I had successfully navigated 3 full years of secondary school without a single alpha-related incident. I was proud of that record. I protected it the same way other people protected their GPA or their athletic statistics. No incidents. No scenes. No unwanted attention from people whose instincts were stronger than their manners. I should have taken the pill. The morning started normal enough. I caught the bus with 30 seconds to spare and spent the ride with my headphones in and my nose buried in a paperback, which was exactly how I preferred to spend all my time when given a choice. The weather was that particular kind of early autumn gray that made everything feel like a photograph taken slightly out of focus, not unpleasant, just muted. I liked those kinds of mornings. They matched my energy. First period was fine. Second period was fine. By the time I reached the break between third and fourth period, I had almost forgotten entirely about the forgotten pill, because the subtle hum of what I could only describe as restlessness that had been building in my lower back since mid-morning was easy enough to attribute to sitting too long in uncomfortable school chairs. Then Abel Hardy walked into the cafeteria. Now, I need to give you some context about Abel Hardy, because if you don't understand who he is, you don't understand why. What happened next was so significant. Abel Hardy was, without exaggeration, the most intimidating person in our school. He was a senior like me, but that was where the similarities ended. He was tall, not just above average tall but architecturally tall, the kind of tall that changed the dimensions of a room when he entered it. He had dark hair that he wore just long enough to be artfully disheveled and sharp features that looked like they'd been designed by someone who was specifically trying to create a face that would make people nervous. His eyes were a dark amber color that read as almost black in low light, and he had the kind of resting expression that made teachers ask him if he was all right before they'd even started class. He was an alpha. Obviously. The kind of alpha that made other alphas straighten their spines and look away first. His dominance didn't radiate so much as it pressed down on the air around him. Like a change in atmospheric pressure. I had spent 3 years successfully avoiding his orbit, which wasn't difficult because Abel Hardy wasn't the type to go out of his way to interact with anyone he didn't already know. He had a small, close circle of people he tolerated and everyone else simply didn't register on his radar, or so I had believed. I was standing in the lunch line, tray in hand, when I felt it, that prickling awareness on the back of my neck that meant someone was looking at me. Not the casual glance and look away kind of looking. The sustained, focused, something is wrong kind of looking. I turned around slowly, because turning around quickly would have drawn more attention. Abel Hardy was standing at the entrance of the cafeteria, which was maybe 30 feet away, and he was staring directly at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before and had never wanted to see directed at me specifically. He looked like a person who had just heard something that didn't make sense and was trying very hard to make it make sense. He looked, in other words, like an alpha who had just caught an unexpected scent. My blood ran cold. I turned back around. I told myself to be calm. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe he was looking at something behind me, maybe I was being paranoid, maybe the lack of suppressant was making me hyper-aware of every social interaction around me the way it sometimes did when my body chemistry was slightly off. I got my food. I paid. I walked as normally and casually as I could to the far corner table where my friend Denny always saved me a seat, and I sat down, and I angled myself so that I was looking away from the cafeteria entrance, you look like you've seen a ghost, Denny said, unwrapping his sandwich with the kind of aggressive cheerfulness that was his default mode of existence. I'm fine, I said. You're doing the thing where your shoulders are basically touching your ears. I'm fine, Denny, he shrugged. And started talking about something else, and I ate my lunch and told myself that whatever had just happened was over and would not be repeated. I was being dramatic. I was letting the lack of suppressant make me anxious about things that weren't actually happening. Then, halfway through lunch, Denny stopped talking mid-sentence. I looked up. Abel Hardy was standing at the end of our table, not passing by. Not glancing in our direction. Standing at the end of our table, tray in hand, looking at me with that same unreadable expression he'd had at the cafeteria entrance. Up close, he was even more arresting than he was at a distance, which was not information I needed. The cafeteria, I noticed, had gotten significantly quieter. Is this seat taken? He said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't have to project to be heard. I stared at him. Denny stared at him. The two people at the adjacent table who I barely knew stared at him. There are literally 40 open seats in this cafeteria, Denny said, because Denny had no self-preservation instincts whatsoever. I know, Abel said, still looking at me. My mouth was very dry. It's not taken, I said, because what else was I going to say? He set his tray down across from me and sat down, and the cafeteria slowly resumed its normal noise level the way water resumes flowing after you've removed your hand from a stream, gradually, tentatively, as if checking first that the obstruction was definitely gone. He didn't say anything. He just ate his lunch. I ate my lunch. Denny ate his lunch and periodically glanced between us with the expression of someone watching a nature documentary who was uncertain whether what they were witnessing was a predator stalking prey or something else entirely. After maybe 5 minutes of this, Abel looked up from his food and said, very quietly, "Did you forget something this morning?" I felt the blood drain out of my face. "I don't know what you mean." He held my gaze for a moment. Then he went back to eating his lunch. He didn't say another word for the rest of the meal. When the bell rang, he picked up his tray, stood up, and left without looking back. Denny turned to me with enormous eyes. "What," he said, "was that?" "Nothing," I said. "That was nothing." It was very much not nothing. The thing about Abel Hardy following you to your next class is that it's extremely noticeable when you have never shared a class with him in 3 years of attending the same school. I found this out when I walked into 4th period English and Abel walked in behind me and took the empty seat 2 rows over. Mrs. Ellison, our English teacher, looked up from her desk. "Mr. Hardy. You're in period 6, I requested a transfer," he said simply. She blinked. "As of when?" "This morning." She looked at her roster, made a small confused sound, and apparently decided this was not a battle worth fighting, because she went back to her notes and said, "All right then. Find a seat." He was already sitting in one. I stared very hard at my copy of the reading assignment we were supposed to have completed over the weekend. I had completed it. I was an excellent student. I focused on that. I focused on the annotated margins and the 3 highlighted passages and the fact that I was prepared and competent and that whatever was currently happening was not my fault and would resolve itself. It did not resolve itself. Abel Hardy sat 2 rows over from me in English and contributed exactly 3 comments to the class discussion, all of which were perceptive enough that Mrs. Ellison praised them, which I found deeply irritating for reasons I couldn't entirely articulate. He wasn't supposed to be insightful. He was supposed to be a vaguely threatening background figure who I successfully avoided. After class, he fell into step beside me in the hallway. "We don't have the same 5th period, I said without looking at him. "I know, so you're just walking with me." "Yes." I stopped walking and looked at him directly for the first time since lunch. This was a mistake, because looking at Abel Hardy directly was like looking at something with too much contrast. Everything else in your field of vision went slightly blurry. "Why?" He looked at me for a long moment with those dark amber eyes that were not quite as unreadable as he probably wanted them to be. There was something in them that looked like conflict, like a person running 2 very different calculations simultaneously and not liking the results of either one. "I'm not sure yet," he said finally. "That's not an answer." "I know, Abel, take your suppressant tomorrow," he said. Then he turned and walked in the opposite direction without another word. I stood in the middle of the hallway and breathed very carefully and told myself that this was fine and manageable and not at all the beginning of something I had spent 3 years carefully ensuring would never happen to me. By the time I got home that afternoon, I had almost convinced myself, I took the pill that was still sitting on my bathroom counter. I stood there and I looked at myself in the mirror for a long time, brown hair that needed a cut, gray eyes that were doing that thing where they went a shade lighter when I was anxious, the faint dusting of freckles across my nose that I'd had since childhood. I looked exactly like myself. I looked exactly like a person who had managed to attract the attention of Abel Hardy through nothing more than a forgotten piece of medication. This is fine, I told my reflection. My reflection, reasonably, did not agree. I made dinner, did my homework. Tried to read and found I couldn't focus, and went to bed at a sensible hour. The next morning I took my suppressant first thing, before I was even fully awake, pressing the small white pill to my tongue and washing it down with the glass of water I kept on my nightstand specifically for this purpose. School was almost normal, almost, because Abel was now in my English class permanently, and because he sat 2 rows over and occasionally I would feel that pressure of sustained attention and look up to find him watching me with an expression I still couldn't name, and then he would look back down at his work as if nothing had happened. He didn't sit with me at lunch again. He went back to his usual corner with the small group of people he tolerated. And I ate with Denny, and everything was fine. For 3 days, everything was fine. Then on Thursday I got caught in the rain walking from the bus stop to school and arrived soaked through and shivering, and because my body was dealing with being cold and damp and generally uncomfortable, it apparently decided that this was an excellent moment to have a minor biological rebellion and partially metabolize the morning suppressant ahead of schedule. I didn't realize this was happening. I hung my wet jacket on the hook at the back of my locker and changed into the spare dry shirt I kept there for emergencies and told myself the warm flush spreading across the back of my neck was just my body temperature normalizing. Abel found me between second and third period, not found me the way he'd found me on Monday, from across a cafeteria, with 30 feet of distance. He rounded a corner and we nearly collided, and I stumbled back half a step, and he caught my arm to steady me, and for approximately 2 seconds we were close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off him, and then every muscle in his body went completely, terrifyingly still. He let go of my arm. I looked up at him. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing something complicated and controlled, the way eyes look when the person behind them is working very hard to maintain an expression. "Austin," he said, very quietly. "Hardy." I said, with slightly less composure than I would have liked, I know. The rain. I know." He took a deliberate step back and put a full arm's length of space between us, which I appreciated and resented simultaneously. "How bad is it?" "It's fine. Minor breakthrough. I'll take a second dose at lunch." He nodded once, slowly, like someone confirming a plan of action. "I'll stay away from you today, that would be ideal, but Austin," he stopped. Whatever he'd been about to say, he reconsidered it. "Never mind. Go to class." I went to class. He stayed away from me that day, as promised. No lingering looks in English. No accidental proximity in the hallways. Nothing, and somehow, irrationally, inexplicably, that felt worse than everything else he'd done that week. "You have an alpha problem," Denny said on Friday at lunch. "I don't have an alpha problem, you have an Abel Hardy problem, which is a specific, elevated subcategory of alpha problem." I put my fork down and looked at him. Denny Chong had been my best friend since we were paired together for a biology project in freshman year and had discovered a mutual disdain for our lab partner's inability to follow basic instructions. He was a beta with the instincts of a journalist and the restraint of someone who had been explicitly told that his tendency to say what he was thinking was, on balance, more useful than the alternative. "I don't have an Abel Hardy problem. He transferred into your English class, administrative coincidence. He walks past your locker between second and third period every day. Your locker is not between any of his classes. Maybe he likes the scenic route, Herb." Denny put down his own fork and gave me the look he reserved for moments when he felt I was being actively unhelpful. "I have been your best friend for 3 years. I was there when you came out to me as Omega sophomore year. I know your presentation schedule. I know that you take your suppressants religiously and that you have a backup dose in your bag at all times and that you take this stuff seriously specifically because you don't want exactly this kind of attention." He paused. "What happened Monday?" I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "I forgot my pill." Denny closed his eyes briefly. "Okay, just for one morning. And my scent isn't even that strong, Denny. I barely have a scent on unmedicated days." Abel Hardy has an extremely elevated sensitivity to omega scents. Everyone knows that. It's part of why the underclassmen are terrified of him. There's a story that went around 2 years ago about him tracking a sophomore scent from 2 floors away. That's definitely an exaggeration, maybe. But even if it's 50% exaggeration, that's still 1 floor's worth of scent tracking. He picked up his fork again. He found you. Herb. And he's been circling you ever since. He hasn't been circling me. He transferred into your English class. You already said that. I felt it bore repeating. I stared at my lunch. It was chicken soup day, which was usually one of the better cafeteria options, but I'd been finding it difficult to taste food properly since Monday, which I was attributing to general anxiety and not to anything biological. I don't want this, I said. I've never wanted this. I've spent 3 years specifically making sure this wouldn't happen. I know, Denny said, more gently. But here's the thing about scent bonds, Herb, they don't really check in with you about what you want first. That's a horrifying thing to say, it's a horrifying biological reality. I'm just the messenger. I thought about the way Abel's jaw had gone tight in the hallway on Thursday. The deliberate step back. The way he'd said I'll stay away from you today, like it was a thing that required effort, like it was a discipline he was imposing on himself rather than a default state. He's trying to control it, I said slowly. Denny looked at me with an expression that suggested he'd arrived at this conclusion significantly earlier. Yes. But the fact that he has to try means, it's already started, I finished. We looked at each other. What do I do? I said, you have a few options. Denny said, in the tone of someone who had clearly been thinking about this for some time. Option 1, you transfer your own classes around to create maximum distance, which will work until your scent regulation is imperfect on any other occasion, which is statistically likely to happen at least once more this school year. Option 2, you have a direct conversation with him about it and establish boundaries and work out a mutual avoidance strategy. Option 3, he paused. What's option 3? You stop pretending that you haven't been noticing him back. I haven't been, Herb. Denny, you've mentioned him 4 times in conversation this week and you allegedly want nothing to do with him. I opened my mouth. I closed it again. I'm just saying, Denny said, with the infuriating reasonableness of someone who was almost certainly right, that avoidance is a lot of work to put into ignoring someone you genuinely have no feelings about. I picked up my fork and ate my chicken soup and said nothing at all, which was, in its own way, an answer. The incident happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the forgotten pill. By that point I had developed what I privately considered a reasonable equilibrium with the situation. Abel was in my English class. He watched me sometimes with that complicated expression. I occasionally watched him back when I was reasonably certain he wouldn't notice. Which was a habit I was extremely unhappy about developing. We didn't speak. We maintained a functional, professional distance that allowed both of us to pretend that Monday in the cafeteria had been an anomaly and that the hallway on Thursday had been an accident and that everything was, broadly, fine. The equilibrium lasted exactly 3 weeks. On that Tuesday, I stayed late after school for a makeup test in chemistry that I'd missed due to a doctor's appointment. It ran longer than expected because Dr. Finch had included 2 bonus questions that were technically optional but that I was constitutionally incapable of leaving blank. By the time I came out of the building, the late afternoon sun was already low and golden, and the bus I usually took had left 20 minutes ago. I texted Denny to let him know I'd missed the bus and was walking. He sent back 3 increasingly dramatic emojis and an offer to come pick me up, but he'd told me earlier that his car was at the mechanic's, so I told him I was fine and started walking. The route from school to my apartment was about 1.5 miles, which was not an unreasonable distance on a nice afternoon, and it was a nice afternoon, cool and clear with the kind of light that made everything look like it was being filmed for a movie about a simpler, prettier world. I put my headphones in and walked and told myself that 1.5 miles was nothing. I walked this route regularly, this was fine. I became aware that someone was behind me after about 3 blocks, not in a frightening way, or not immediately. It started as that prickling awareness again, the same one from the cafeteria, and I told myself it was just ambient paranoia and kept walking. But the awareness didn't fade the way ambient paranoia usually did. It sharpened, if anything, and after another half block I took one headphone out and listened, footsteps. Even, unhurried. Approximately half a block behind me, I turned around. Abel Hardy was walking behind me with his hands in his jacket pockets and his school bag over one shoulder, looking at me with an expression of someone who had been caught doing something they weren't sure was wrong. I stopped walking. He stopped walking. We looked at each other from half a block's distance. You're following me, I said. I'm walking in the same direction, he said. You live on the east side. My apartment is northwest, a beat of silence. I know where your apartment is. I felt something shift in my chest, not quite alarm. Not quite the opposite of alarm. How do you know where my apartment is? He was quiet for a moment. Then he walked the half block between us and stopped when he was close enough to talk at a normal volume and far enough that the distance was clearly intentional, clearly chosen. I've known since the first Monday, he said. I wasn't following you that day. He stopped. Started again. I know it doesn't make it better. I wasn't following you. I happened to be in the area and your scent, he stopped again, my scent, yes, you tracked my scent home. Not intentionally. He said it without defensiveness, which somehow made it more unsettling and less unsettling at the same time. He said it the way someone admits to something they've done and are genuinely uncertain how to categorize, not as wrongdoing, not as nothing, but as something that exists in a space that doesn't have a clean label. I was heading toward the market on Clement Street. You must have walked that route earlier in the week. The scent, he exhaled. It doesn't fade quickly. Not for me. Not for, he looked at me carefully. You know what I'm saying, you're saying I leave scent trails, all omegas do. A small pause. I notice them more than most, I'm aware of your reputation, I said, something flickered in his expression. What you've heard is mostly exaggerated. Mostly. His jaw shifted slightly, something between a concession and a challenge. I've never followed anyone without their awareness. I've never entered anyone's space without consent. I've never, he stopped, and something about the way he stopped suggested he was drawing a line, listing the things he hadn't done in order to establish what he was and wasn't. I know what it looks like. A junior with an enhanced sensitivity trailing an omega's scent. I know how it reads like exactly what it is, does it? He said it quietly, not as a challenge. As a genuine question, I looked at him for a long time. The late afternoon light was doing unfair things to the angles of his face. Picking out the warmth in his otherwise dark eyes, softening the sharpness of his features into something that looked, almost, approachable. I thought about Denny saying you stop pretending you haven't been noticing him back. I thought about the 3 weeks of functional equilibrium and the effort it had taken to maintain it and the fact that I was standing on a public sidewalk half a mile from my apartment having a conversation I had spent 3 years engineering my life to avoid. Why are you here? I asked. Not on the sidewalk. Here. Why are you? I gestured between us. Why are you doing any of this? He was quiet for long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said. Because your scent doesn't just register to me as omega. It registers as, he stopped again. Tried a different approach. You know how most scents are general. You recognize the category, the designation, and you move on. Yes, yours doesn't work that way. For me. He said it with a kind of bare, reluctant honesty that felt like it cost him something. It's specific. It's yours. I've been trying to figure out if that means what I think it means or if I'm constructing something that isn't there because, he looked away for a moment, and for the first time in the entire conversation he looked less like an apex predator and more like a person. Because I'd rather know for certain than act on something and be wrong. My heart was doing something complicated. I ignored it. And if you're not wrong, he looked back at me. Then I'd want to do this properly. With your knowledge. With your choice in it. The late afternoon was very quiet around us. A car passed. Somewhere down the block, someone was playing music that was too distant to make out, just a rhythm and a suggestion of melody. I have a question, I said. All right, the cafeteria. On Monday. You asked me if I'd forgotten something. How did you know it was the suppressant and not just, I gestured vaguely. How did you know it wasn't just my baseline? He considered this. Because I'd been in the same building as you for 3 years. He said, and I'd never smelled you before that morning. I thought about what that meant. I thought about what it meant that he'd been registering my absence from his senses for 3 years without apparently realizing it, the same way you might not notice silence until something breaks it. I need to think, I said. I know, I need time to think about this. I know, he said again, still with that same even, undemanding patience that I had not expected from him and was finding deeply difficult to categorize. I'm not asking for anything from you, Austin. He glanced away, then back. I wanted you to know what was happening and why. You deserve that much. I studied him for another moment. Then I turned and started walking again. After about 10 steps I stopped and turned back. He hadn't moved. Abel, I said. Something shifted in his expression at the sound of his name. Yeah, if you're going to walk in the same direction as me anyway, I said, slowly, you might as well walk at the same distance. He was quiet for a moment. Then he walked forward until he was beside me. We walked the rest of the way to my building without saying anything at all, and somehow it was the least uncomfortable silence I had experienced in recent memory. I spent 3 days thinking about it. If you are still watching, subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Now let's see what happens next. This is what I knew. First, Abel Hardy had been peripherally aware of my scent absence for 3 years, which meant some part of him had been tracking me for 3 years without either of us being aware of it, which was either the most romantic thing I'd ever heard or the most unsettling depending on how you looked at it, and I had been spending those 3 days trying to decide which of those interpretations was more accurate. Second, when I thought about Abel Hardy, which I was doing with embarrassing frequency, I did not feel the low-grade dread that I associated with unwanted attention. I felt something else. Something that I had been successfully relabeling as anxiety and wariness for 3 weeks and was now having significant difficulty relabeling as anything other than what it was. Third, I had forgotten my suppressant pill one time in 3 years. One morning. And that morning, I had apparently been broadcasting a scent so specific and so unmistakably mine that the one person in the school with the sensitivity to detect it had found me across a crowded cafeteria. Fourth, and most critically, I had asked him to walk beside me, not because I felt pressured. Not because I was performing reasonableness to avoid a scene. Because something in me had wanted him there, and I had let that want make the decision before the more cautious, controlled part of my brain could overrule it. I sat in my apartment on Thursday evening with a bowl of cereal I wasn't eating and the textbook I wasn't reading open in front of me, and I thought about the word that described what Abel had been trying not to say on the sidewalk. The specific technical term for when an alpha's scent recognition narrowed from categorical to individual, when one omega's scent stopped registering as generic and started registering as the word. The word neither of us had said, faded. It was a clinical term as much as a romantic one. Scientifically speaking, it referred to an extremely rare biochemical configuration where two people's pheromone profiles complemented each other at a structural level that the body recognized as optimal compatibility. It was, in the literature, described as mutual, both people affected, both people's scent profiles changed by proximity to the other, both people's bodies doing the recognizing. I thought about the fact that I had never noticed being particularly drawn to anyone. That I had never found another person's physical presence particularly compelling. That I had successfully navigated 3 years of secondary school without developing so much as a crush. Which I had attributed to being too busy and too focused and too private for that kind of thing. I thought about the way the week after Abel had sat across from me at lunch had felt different from the week before. Louder, somehow. More textured. Like something in the air had changed composition. I sat there with my cereal and my unread textbook, and I understood, with the quiet, terrible clarity of someone who has arrived at a conclusion they were trying to avoid, that I had already known. That I had known since the cafeteria, maybe since before the cafeteria, in whatever wordless way the body knows things before the mind agrees to acknowledge them. I was his omega, he was my alpha. I had been spending 3 weeks processing information that my biology had already decided. I put down my cereal spoon. I texted Denny, I think I'm in trouble. He responded within seconds, how much trouble? Me, the faded kind, 3 dots. 3 more dots. Then, me, I know, Denny, me, I know, Denny, are you okay? I thought about it honestly. Am I okay? I was sitting in my apartment on a Thursday night having realized that the most intimidating person in my school had been correct about something that my own body had been signaling to me for 3 weeks, and that the reason I had been so resistant to acknowledging it was less about genuine indifference and more about a very deep, very old fear of what it would mean to let someone in. Not just in the way that everyone's personal space gets negotiated, but in the way that this specific situation meant, fully, permanently, all the way in. I'm okay, I typed. Just recalibrating, Denny, do you need me to come over? Me, no. I think I need to sleep, Denny, text me in the morning. I went to bed. I lay there in the dark and I thought about dark amber eyes and a deliberate step back and I'll stay away from you today and the care of it, the restraint of it, the way someone who wanted to protect your choice showed you they understood the weight of what they were asking. I slept better than I had in 3 weeks. I found him the next morning. This was significant. In all the previous exchanges, Abel had done the finding. I had been the one being found, located, noticed from across rooms and down hallways. I had been the one discovered. I had never once been the one to seek. I knew where his first period class was because Denny was in the same class and had complained about the seating arrangement on the first day of school. I arrived at the door 3 minutes before the bell, which meant there were still people in the hallway, which gave me the advantage of a crowd if I needed to extract myself from a conversation that went poorly. I spotted him at his locker. He had his back to me, and from this angle. With the morning light coming through the far window and the general noise of the pre-bell hallway around us, he looked less like an apex predator and more like a person who was in the process of deciding whether today's reading would fit in his bag. Something about that small, ordinary image made something loosen in my chest. Abel, I said. He turned around. He looked surprised for exactly half a second, which for Abel Hardy was roughly the equivalent of anyone else dropping their jaw. Then his expression settled back into its usual careful neutrality. Austin, I've been thinking, I said, about what you said. On the sidewalk, he looked at me. He didn't push. He just waited. With that patience that I was beginning to understand was not indifference but its opposite, a kind of deliberate stillness that gave other people room. You said you wanted to do it properly, I said. With my knowledge. With my choice in it, yes, I want to understand what properly looks like, I said. Before I decide anything. I want to understand what you actually want and what you're actually proposing and what I paused, gathering the words. What the endgame is. For you, he was quiet for a moment. Around us, the hallway was thinning as people filtered into their classrooms. You want me to be explicit about it, I want you to be honest about it, he considered this. Then, I want to spend time with you. I want to learn whether what I think is happening between us is what's actually happening. I want to do that at your pace and with your ongoing consent. A pause. And if it turns out to be what I think it is, his voice was still even, still level, but something beneath it was not. I want to be with you. Properly. As in, not as a biological event that happened to you, but as something you choose. The bell rang. We were now, technically, both late. Neither of us moved. Okay, I said. He blinked. Okay, we can spend time together. And see. I was aware that I was being approximately as eloquent as a freshman writing their first personal essay. But I was also working with an elevated heart rate and the significant cognitive load of having deliberately walked up to Abel Hardy and initiated a conversation about feelings before 8 a.m., so I was giving myself credit for being coherent at all. Something happened in his expression. It was subtle, like a lock disengaging rather than a door opening, but it was there. You want to, I want to, I said. Which surprises me significantly, yeah. A small, quiet pause. Me too. The hallway was empty now. We were definitely both going to be late. We should go to class, I said. Yes, he agreed, and didn't move. Abel, yeah, go to class. The corner of his mouth moved. Very slightly, in a direction that was not quite a smile but was in the same general neighborhood. You first. I turned and walked to my own first period class with my heart doing something rhythmic and completely unreliable, and the smile that I had been suppressing since before I'd even reached his locker finally broke free somewhere around the third staircase, where I was reasonably certain no one who mattered could see it. We started with lunch. Abel started eating at my table again on Monday, except this time it wasn't an ambush. I had texted him over the weekend. We had exchanged numbers after the Friday hallway conversation, which I was still thinking about, and he had responded with exactly as many words as were necessary. Which I was beginning to recognize as his default mode. Not taciturn. Just precise. He didn't speak unless he had something to say, but when he did have something to say, it was worth saying. Then he handled it with admirable dignity, by which I mean he spent the first 10 minutes of the first lunch making a face like a person watching a sequel to a movie they'd thought was finished, and then apparently decided that since nothing catastrophic was happening, he could be normal about it. "You're in Herb's English class," he said to Abel, with the energy of someone establishing diplomatic relations. "Yes," Abel said. "Mrs. Ellison give you the Fitzgerald assignment yet?" "Last week." "What angle are you taking?" And somehow, without any ceremony, Denny and Abel were having a conversation about American literary modernism, and I was sitting between them eating my lunch and feeling something that I could only describe as structural relief, the sensation of two separate parts of your life fitting together more easily than expected. I learned things about Abel in those first weeks that the school's collective mythology had not included. He read extensively, not just what was assigned, but widely and for pleasure, the kind of reading that left margins annotated and spines softened. He had an extremely dry sense of humor that revealed itself only when he was comfortable. Which I noticed because I was now in a position to recognize the difference between Abel being uncomfortable and Abel being at ease. He was patient in a way that went beyond simple self-control. When something or someone frustrated him, he got quieter rather than louder, stiller rather than more agitated. The intimidation other people felt around him, I realized, came not from aggression but from intensity, the way some people's full attention had weight, had pressure, had presence that was impossible to overlook. He was, I was discovering, very attentive in small ways. He noticed when the environmental noise levels were getting to me before I noticed myself. He noticed when I hadn't eaten enough. He noticed when my shoulders were doing the thing where they touched my ears, and he would occasionally ask a question that had nothing to do with what was stressing me but which was clearly designed to redirect my focus, which was a practice of care so subtle and so practiced that it suggested he'd been watching me long enough to know what worked. I found this out over the course of many small exchanges and precisely none of the dramatic romantic scenes I'd consumed in fiction, which was fine. Fiction had given me unrealistic expectations about the timeline of these things. Real proximity was slower and more interesting. We started walking home together on the days we both stayed late. It began with that first Tuesday, but Tuesdays became any day when the timing worked, and any day when the timing worked became most days. We walked and talked about books and class and the particular frustrations of being seniors with an institutional reluctance to let them act like adults, and we didn't talk about what was developing between us because we were both, in our different ways, people who preferred to understand a thing before naming it. I noticed that he always positioned himself between me and the street when we walked. I noticed that he adjusted his stride so it matched mine rather than making me adjust to his. I noticed that he knew my coffee order from the cart by the bus stop without me having told him, which meant he'd remembered from watching me order it once, which was the kind of thing that should have been alarming and instead felt like being seen in a way I wasn't accustomed to. "You're watching him back now," Denny observed one afternoon, approximately 6 weeks in. "I'm not." "You watched him walk across the quad for approximately 45 uninterrupted seconds just now." I was thinking. "You were thinking about him." I picked up my pen and pretended to be doing something productive with my notes. This is not the supportive best friend behavior I was promised. "I'm extremely supportive," Denny said, leaning back in his chair. "I'm supportively pointing out that you are significantly more gone on this person than you are comfortable admitting, which is fine. I just want you to be aware of it." "I'm aware of it," I said, quietly enough that it wasn't quite a concession but not quite not one either. Denny nodded, satisfied, and went back to his own notes. The thing was, he was right. I was aware of it. I had been aware of it since somewhere around the end of October, when Abel and I had been walking home and it had started to rain and we ducked under the awning of the closed florists on Pembury Street and stood shoulder to shoulder watching the rain come down. And he had said, completely without preamble, "I like walking with you," and I had said, "I know," and then we had stood there in comfortable, rain acoustic silence for another 10 minutes until it eased, and the whole time the warmth of him beside me had felt like something I was afraid to name because naming it would mean acknowledging how much I was already depending on it. I was aware of it, I just wasn't ready to say it yet. It was November, we had a project deadline in English that week, a comparative analysis that Mrs. Ellison had, somewhat sadistically, assigned as a joint paper, meaning paired submissions. Abel had been assigned to me, which I suspected Mrs. Ellison had engineered with either complete obliviousness or complete awareness. And I genuinely couldn't decide which. We decided to work at my apartment because Abel's home situation was, I had gathered from brief references, complicated in ways he hadn't elaborated on and I hadn't pressed. My apartment was small but quiet, a studio with a separate kitchen area and a lot of bookshelves, which Abel had looked at the first time he came over with an expression of recognition, like someone arriving somewhere they'd correctly predicted. We sat on opposite ends of my small sofa with our laptops and papers between us and worked for 2 hours in a kind of focused parallel quiet that I had only ever associated, previously, with being alone. He was genuinely easy to work alongside. He didn't need to fill silence with sound. He didn't get distracted and then try to distract me by proxy. He worked and I worked, and occasionally one of us would say something about the paper and the other would consider it and respond, and then we'd go back to work. Around 9 o'clock I made tea and brought it over, and we took a break from the paper, and he was looking at my bookshelves and I said, "You can borrow something if you want," and he pulled out a collection of short stories I'd had since I was 15 with a question in his look, and I said, "That one's good," and he looked at the back cover, and I watched his face while he read it in the way that you watch someone look at something you love. And what I felt was so clean and simple that it almost frightened me. I had been in love before. Or I had thought I had, a gentle thing in freshman year, a person in my history class who'd been kind to me during a difficult semester, which had produced something that felt like fondness and longing in roughly equal parts and had faded by summer. That had been a watercolor. This was a different medium entirely. "Abel," I said. He looked up from the back cover. "I think," I stopped. Started again. "I've been trying to figure out the right time to say this, and I'm beginning to think there isn't one, so." I took a breath. "I think I'm falling in love with you. I think I've been falling for a while, and I think you should know that I know it's not just the biology. I know the difference between what my body is registering and what I'm choosing, and I want you to know that this is a choice." He was very still. That specific kind of stillness that I'd learned meant he was processing something that mattered. "You're sure?" he said. Not a challenge. A real question. He needed to know. "I'm sure," I said. "I've been thinking about it for 2 months, Abel. I don't say things I'm not sure about." He put the book down on the cushion beside him. He moved the papers that were between us, carefully, precisely, setting them on the coffee table without disarranging them, and then he looked at me from a distance of approximately 3 inches and said, very quietly, "I've been in love with you since the hallway. The Thursday in the rain. I know that's too fast." "I know, it's not too fast," I said, because I meant it. He looked at me with those dark amber eyes that I had spent 3 months learning the particular language of, and the thing in them now was not complicated or conflicted or controlled. It was simply, clearly, undeniably present. He reached out, very slowly, and his fingers found my jaw, and he tilted my face up, giving me every possible moment to object, to move away, to make a different choice. I didn't. He kissed me carefully, the way you kiss something you've been careful about for a long time and have finally allowed yourself to stop being careful about. And then I kissed him back with all the decision and all the choosing that I had been doing for months, and it felt like landing somewhere I had been traveling toward for longer than I'd known I was moving. We handed in the English paper the next morning with approximately 45 minutes to spare, which I considered a significant personal achievement given the circumstances. Mrs. Ellison, when she got the papers back to us 2 weeks later, had written at the top, "Excellent synthesis." The arguments complement each other unusually well. I thought about telling her that this was because we had been sitting shoulder to shoulder rereading each other's paragraphs and adjusting our writing to meet each other's reasoning naturally. And then decided that this was not a conversation I needed to have with my English teacher. Abel met me at my locker that morning. This was new. He'd been meeting me at my locker now instead of in the hallway, which was a few feet and a completely different kind of statement. He handed me a coffee from the cart by the bus stop. I had not asked for it. He had brought it anyway. "Did you do the calc homework?" I asked. "Last night," he said. "The last problem took me 40 minutes, 25, he said, in that exact tone that should have been irritating and wasn't even slightly. Denny arrived 30 seconds later, looked at us, looked at the coffee, looked at the specific distance between us that was now the distance of people who had chosen each other rather than people who were navigating proximity, and said, 'Good morning,' with enormous and entirely transparent satisfaction. 'Good morning, Denny,' Abel said. Denny made a small, private, delighted sound and fell into step with us as we walked to first period. Life after the shift was, in many ways, exactly the same as life before the shift, because it turned out that what Abel and I had been building over those 3 months was not the waiting room for something else but the thing itself, a specific kind of closeness that was already real before we had named it, and that became, once named, simply more visible to both of us. He walked with me. He texted precisely as often as was warranted and always with something worth saying. He came to the bookstore where I worked on Saturdays and sat in the back corner for an hour or two with whatever he was reading, and I shelved books and helped customers and occasionally looked over at him, and every time I looked over he was either reading or already watching me with that expression that I now knew exactly how to name. I brought him things, small ones, specific ones. A bookmark shaped like a knife that I found in the sale bin because of an extremely obscure reference he'd made in passing. A newspaper article about something he'd mentioned once. A recommendation for a film that I'd thought about for 2 days before mentioning because I wanted to be sure he'd like it and was certain enough only after 2 days consideration. These were the ways we spoke before we developed the more direct language. And because we'd built them carefully, they didn't disappear once we had the direct language. They accumulated. You planned this, Denny told me one afternoon, with an air of someone reaching a conclusion they found philosophically interesting. Not consciously. But look at your pattern, you've been learning him for months. Figuring out what he needs before he says it. You've basically been his omega in practice since October. That's a slightly reductive way to put it, I said. Is it wrong? I thought about it honestly. No, I admitted. But it goes both ways. He does the same thing, I know. Denny said. That's kind of the point, the thing about being with Abel, and I was beginning to allow myself to use that word, being with, in the full sense of what it meant, was that it was the first time in my life that being known didn't feel like a vulnerability. I had spent a long time keeping my omega status careful and private, managing my scent, managing my presentation, managing the expectations that came with the designation so that no one could use that information to limit how they saw me or what they expected of me. I had been so practiced at management that I'd started to think of closeness as inherently costly, as something that required constant maintenance and careful calibration to remain safe. Abel didn't make it costly. He made it easier. When I told him about the management, about the 3 years of suppressance and avoidance and careful navigation, he listened without interruption and without the impulse to reassure me too quickly, which would have meant he'd stopped listening too soon. He said, at the end, "That sounds exhausting." It was, I said. It is. Less now, he said softly, like an agreement. December arrived with cold air and the particular excitement of nearly being done with secondary school that lived alongside the particular dread of nearly being done with secondary school. Everyone was talking about next year, universities, gap years. Plans, the vast uncertain opening of what came after. It was the kind of period where you had too many feelings and not enough categories for them, and the only sensible response was to stay present and deal with the future when it arrived. Abel and I were sitting on my sofa one evening, his side and my side having long since collapsed into a general shared middle, when he said, somewhat out of nowhere, "I put in my university application today." "Which one?" I said, looking up from my reading. "Caldwell. The environmental science program." He paused. "It's the same city as Harwick." I looked at him. Harwick was where I'd applied, my first choice, the literature and linguistics program. I hadn't told him I'd applied there. Or, I stopped. Had I? I tried to remember. I mentioned it in October, I said slowly. When I was talking about the open day. Yes, he said, you remembered. I remember everything you say. I looked at him for a moment with the particular feeling that I associated with Abel doing something so quietly, specifically caring that it short-circuited my ability to respond with anything proportionate. Did you apply there because I'm applying there? He considered the question with his usual honesty. I applied there because the program is excellent and because the city has the research institutes I need access to. And because, a pause. Knowing you'd also be there was not a deterrent. That's a very measured way to say something very significant. Yes, he agreed, calmly. I looked back at my book. My heart was doing its rhythmic, unreliable thing. For the record, I said, knowing you might also be there is also not a deterrent. From the corner of my eye, I saw the corner of his mouth move. We sat together in the warmth of my apartment while December pressed against the windows, and I thought about how this had started, a forgotten pill, a morning without suppressant, a scent that apparently had been mine and his simultaneously for 3 years without either of us knowing, a cafeteria and a hallway and a sidewalk and 3 months of careful building. I thought about the version of myself who had left that pill on the counter and caught the bus and thought the worst day of his life was starting, That version of me had been wrong about so many things. He had been wrong about the pill being the problem. He had been wrong about the morning being the worst. He had been wrong about what the connection meant, had assumed it meant a loss of control, a loss of the careful construction he'd built to protect himself, a loss of the autonomy that had always felt synonymous with safety. He had not understood that it is possible to choose and be chosen simultaneously. That being seen doesn't require you to stop seeing yourself. That the specific rightness of a person can feel like addition rather than subtraction. I had a lot of grace for that version of myself. He had been working with incomplete information and had drawn reasonable conclusions from what he had. But I was glad, in the particular way that you are glad for things that require difficulty to arrive at, that the information had eventually become complete. Abel, I said, I'm glad I forgot the pill. He was quiet for a moment. Then, so am I. Outside, the December night had settled fully in, and the city did its city things, traffic and light and the small sounds of other people's lives intersecting briefly with the air outside my window. Inside, the lamp was on and the books were close and Abel was beside me, a warm and specific and chosen presence. And everything that I had been so careful to protect was still exactly mine, plus this, plus him. It turned out that was all the difference. When people ask me how we got together, and people do ask, because it turns out that Abel Hardy and I becoming a thing was, in the small universe of Creston High, a story worth discussing. I tell them it started with a forgotten pill and a crowded cafeteria. This is true, but it's also incomplete in the way that all origin stories are incomplete. It started with 3 years of parallel existence in the same school. It started with a biochemistry that neither of us asked for and both of us eventually chose. It started with Abel being careful enough to let me choose. And with me being brave enough to, we got into our respective programs at Caldwell and Harwick. The cities are a 20-minute train ride apart, which we decided was workable. Denny, for the record, is going to a school in a completely different region, which he told me with the energy of someone who was very pleased about it and also slightly apprehensive, and I told him he was going to be brilliant, which he is. On the last day of school, Abel found me at my locker one more time. He was wearing the expression I had come to know as his version of a smile, not a large expression, but a real one, the kind that lived in the eyes more than the mouth. He handed me a book, something new. Something he'd been reading, with a note tucked inside the front cover. I opened the note later, on the train home from our graduation ceremony, with the afternoon light coming through the window at the same golden angle it had been on that first sidewalk. The note said, "For the record, I noticed you before the cafeteria. I just didn't know what to do with it yet. Now I do." I sat with that for a long moment, watching the city slide past the window, and I thought about all the versions of noticing that had accumulated between us, across cafeterias and hallways and rainy awnings and small sofas and the daily practice of two people learning the specific shape of each other until the shape became familiar, became necessary, became home. I took out my phone and texted him, "You could have just said hello." His response came back within a minute, "You were scary." I laughed out loud in the train car and the elderly woman across from me looked up from her knitting with mild interest. I smiled at her and she smiled back and went back to her knitting. I typed, "I'm 5'8" and I work in a bookstore." Abel said you were intensely focused and you looked like a person who had decided exactly how their life was going to go and would not appreciate interference. I thought about that version of myself, the one with the controlled margins and the backup suppressant and the 3-year record of 0 incidents. He had not been wrong, exactly. He had just been working from a premise that turned out to be flawed, that the life he had decided on had no room for this. It had always had room for this. It had been waiting, the way a sentence waits for its last word. I said you were also scary. For the record, Abel asked past tense, I said present tense. You're still scary. I've just stopped minding. 3 dots. Then, good, then, after a pause, I'll be at the station at 6. We can get dinner. I looked out the train window at the city I was leaving and the life that was opening ahead of me, the university and the new city and the literature program I had worked for and the person I was going to keep choosing and who kept choosing me, and I felt, with the whole uncomplicated weight of it, lucky, not in the passive way. Not in the way that luck arrives without your participation. In the way that luck is what you call the intersection of what you were given and what you did with it. I had been given a biology I didn't ask for. I had been given a person who understood restraint and patience and the specific value of giving someone their choice. And I had done something with both of those things. I had shown up, I had been honest, I had been brave on a Friday morning before 8 a.m. with an elevated heart rate, and I had said yes. I tucked Abel's note back inside the front cover of the book. I looked out the window. 6 o'clock, I'd be there. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Subscribe, drop a comment, and I'll see you in the next story.